If you remember our previous sessions, hopefully they're still a little bit fresh in your mind. I know it's been a little while. But Shaul has been telling kind of his personal history in the last one we've read. You know, him really becoming a believer, having a transformational experience, you know, his road, his paths, what God has done with him. That he talked about his journey to Jerusalem. He talked about all the relationships that he had with the others, you know, who were believers. And so he's explaining this all to his disciples. I want you to keep in mind the purpose of his letter. Remember that the purpose of his letter is that some people have come and they started to teach things that he doesn't agree with. They're troubling his disciples. They're stirring things up that are not right, and the kinds of teachings that they are advancing, he disagrees with very much. So one of the things that these agitators that have come to Galatia are trying to propose is that people get circumcised and become basically fully Jewish, you know. And so Shaul opposes that very much, and he gives us all the different reasons. So he, in a sense, he's fighting for the dignity of his disciples to be Gentiles and continue to be Gentiles, you know, as the Lord has called them. So we've seen that in the introductory parts that we've read of the previous chapters, and so now we are still a little bit in a history lesson. So since he's explained his relationship to Jerusalem leaders, now what's going to happen is he's going to recount one particular episode that he had with Kepha, with Peter, right? And this has happened in Antioch. Now, he's bringing up this incident. I want you to realize why. Everything that Shaul writes is very purposeful. He's bringing up this incident not just to show that him and Peter are not friends, not to show that they disagree, because he kind of made it sound like he doesn't care. You know, in the previous section when he talked about Jerusalem, he said, well, I don't care who's important and things like that. That kind of sounded a little bit maybe what can sound to us as disrespectful, sort of. So he's not bringing this up to show that him and Peter are not friends and they had a big fight and they had a big falling out. But what he wants to show that he's independent, that he holds on to his truth independently of who doesn't agree with him. So even if Kepha, even one of the main disciples of Yeshua, if he's going to disagree with him, he's going to call him on it. Because basically what Shaul is trying to say, look, I'm an independent thinker, and I want to show you that I don't follow the crowd, basically. Especially, he wishes to show you that he doesn't follow the crowd when it comes to the issue of the Gentiles, because this is what this letter is all about. This is about his Gentiles disciples being forced to convert, to get circumcised, to become fully Jews, to be acceptable to God. So, having said that, I should mention in this intro just a few words about Antioch as a city. Obviously, if you know your history, you hear the word Antioch, you think probably Antiochus as a famous man. Maybe Antiochus. There were several Antiochus kings. They were all kings of a particular region, region just north of Israel, and so that was the capital. Antioch is the capital. So Antiochus is the name of king. You got Antiochus first, second, third, fourth. Fourth one is really famous because why? That's the Maccabean Wars, right? So that's where we get that. And actually, Antioch was a very important city. Obviously, it's a Gentile city, but in the Roman period, it had particular significance. Part of it because of where it was located. If you look at where Antioch was, it's just north of Israel. Is really what we're talking about. When you look at the map, and we've been speaking about Galatia, right? So Galatia is in Turkey, which is Asia Minor. So if you look at your map carefully, you would see that the very, very southern part of what is Asia Minor would be the city of Antioch there. So, an important city, and one of the things to keep in mind, unlike many cities throughout the entire Mediterranean world, this particular city was unique in the sense that it had a quite sizable Jewish community. And in this city, the Jewish community coexisted pretty well with the Romans. And so, because of this particular dynamic, now not all the Roman cities had large Jewish communities. That one just happened to have quite large Jewish community. Damascus, we talked earlier, also was one of the cities where there was a large Jewish community, and Antioch. So, because of this particular dynamic, Antioch became one of the first cities that missionaries would go to. When people would go proclaim the gospel, of course, the Jews would go to their own. And why? Because everybody's interconnected, people got relatives, people got trade connections, business connections, and everything. And so Antioch is just one of those cities that has, the connections. So one of the kind of first proclamations of the Messiah outside of the land of Israel would naturally go to places like that. So there's been a lot of activity in that area of that sort, and because of that, a messianic community began to form in that area very early on. And Barnabas, if you remember reading Acts, Barnabas visited the city and actually aided in the establishment of that community. He did a lot to make it happen. So he's the one who brought Shaul there. He brought Shaul to teach new believers to Antioch. He just basically said, you need to come because these people need your help, and you're a great teacher, you're the right person to disciple all these new believers. And of course, keep in mind that despite of having just a simply large Jewish community, it's a Gentile city, so there will be a lot of proselytes, there will be a lot of God-fearers that are associated with other synagogues. Every time Jews and Gentiles intersect, you're going to have this people kind of in the middle. You know, proselytes, when I say proselyte, what I mean basically is a convert. Proselyte is a new convert to Judaism. The Gentile who lived most of his life in Gentile ways, got circumcised, became a Jew. Full conversion. When I say God-fear, what I mean is that is a person who is living in and among the Jewish community, maybe to some degree, kind of coming in and out, very curious about Jewish spirituality, maybe sit in on the synagogue services and participate in some way, shape, or form in the life of the community, but not necessarily be a full convert. These are the people who would not necessarily get circumcised. They may live a righteous lifestyle and even be as good as anybody else, but they might just not go the full step of circumcision. So they're called God-fearers throughout the history of Israel. And believe it or not, Israel had a very sophisticated theology even by that point, where they said, well, you know, you don't really have to be Jewish to be loved by God. You know, you can be a righteous Gentile. And so these God-fearers, that's in a sense what they were. They didn't feel like they had to become Jewish. So those were God-fearers. And then of course there were non-Jews, you know, and many non-believers and many Romans, you know, Hellenists in Antioch. And so Kepha is very well known in Antioch by that time. Why? Well, because he's one of the original disciples, right? And he just happens to be a missionary who comes in there and travels there and speaks there and teaches there as well. And so, in fact, the church tradition places him as the bishop of Antioch, actually, but not all church tradition, because remember, he's supposed to be the bishop of Rome, according to some church traditions. Because remember, Peter's supposed to be the first pope, according to the Western church tradition. So, of course, you can't be a bishop of Antioch and a bishop of Rome at the same time. So, you know how that works. Church tradition even disagrees on that. But, you know, some do. And so, in this environment, in this city of Antioch, keeping in mind what I just told you about the city, this trouble, this conflict that we are going to read today about, that's where it's brewing. That's what's happening. So, I'm going to read it in segments. I'm not going to read the whole thing out at once. We're kind of going to read it in segments and then go through it piece by piece. I'm going to read verses 11 through 13 to give us enough clue of what's happening here. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of circumcision. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Let's stop right there and talk about through few features that are here in these verses. Number one, it says that verse 11 says that Shaul opposed Peter to his face. What in the world does that mean? That means it was probably public, and it was very direct. He didn't beat around the bush. He just told him, "You're wrong," and he told it in front of everybody else. That's what he means by that. And notice that Shaul says he did this because there's a cause statement over there. He says, "I put him in his face because he stood condemned." So this is an interesting phrase because this is a past tense. He was already condemned. So he's opposing him because he's already condemned. In Greek over here, if you look, you have a past perfect tense. You know, past perfect means function. The action has already been completed. It's done. It's finished. There's nothing. There's no going back. It's not something ongoing. He's done. He's condemned. It's perfect tense. Something has been done. Okay. So, and then the sentence continues to overflow into verse 2 because the sentence doesn't stop there. So we're going to learn of how and why he was condemned. He was condemned by his actions right here. Before certain Jews came down, he ate with the Gentiles. But then he suddenly stopped. See, that was his condemnation. The condemnation is the fact that he was not consistent. He called him on his inconsistency. And the condemnation was his very own actions of prior and then later showed that he was wrong. Okay, so verse 13, look at verse 13 and see what we see there. It says that other Jews followed his example. So Kepha not just, didn't do something right, but he just basically stopped sharing meals with non-Jews. Okay? But other people followed his example. And even Barnabas followed this practice as well. Now remember, Barnabas is a good friend of Shaul. There, so it says, even Barnabas, when he says it like that, it says, I can't believe even Barnabas, even this guy who I really respect and really, really like, even he went that way too. But the key word in this verse is hypocrisy. Hypokrisis. Hypokrisis is the hypocrisy in Greek. And when you and I read this in English, it's a little bit tricky. This is where I told you there's many times that we read the Bible, we are led by the thinking that we understand what it means, because we're thinking in the mentality of our modern Western mind, but we're reading an ancient Eastern document. So you and I say easily, oh, we know what hypocrisy means, right? And if I asked you around, you probably have no difficulty defining to me what is hypocrisy and what is a hypocrite. And so for Greeks, this word did have something to do with acting. Okay, perhaps being something you're not, or saying one thing and doing the other thing. And that is how most people today understand word hypocrisy from the classical Greek literature. That is what you're going to take away. If you're going to read the works of the philosophers, that's what you're going to take away. If you're going to read the great plays and the dramas and all the tragedies and things like that, you're going to carry away this meaning of the word hypocrisy. However, in Jewish literature, the word is used in an entirely different way. Even though Jewish literature written in Greek language, Jews tend to use that word differently and tend to put a slightly different nuance into that word. They never talk about acting or pretending to be something you're not or anything like that. In Jewish literature, the word has been used in a sense of evil. So when somebody is a hypocrite, they are acting in an evil way. They are acting deceitfully, and they're lying. So you can see that there's enough similarity, yet there's a slightly different understanding in Jewish community. It's not about acting, it's just that you are being disingenuous, you are lying, you're deceiving, you're not being honest. And that's considered evil in ancient Judaism. Clearly there's no kind of gray area in that particular situation. So there wasn't no pretense or acting notions in Jewish understanding of this particular Greek word, hypocrite. And having said that, what is the evil action that Peter is doing here? What is the evil action that Barnabas and other Jews are doing here? Why are they being labeled by this very unkind word? Well, the fact that they knew the truth and acted not in accordance with it is what they're doing. That's the evil. They ate with non-Jews before and then stopped doing so only because the visitors from Jerusalem, who probably did not agree with that. That whole comment about the circumcision party, don't buy into that. It has nothing to do, there's no word party, there's just the word circumcision in Greek. When scriptures say circumcision, they just mean Jews. When they say uncircumcision, they mean non-Jews. There's no circumcision party or uncircumcision party. There's no political factions here of any sort. So the word party has been put there by translators to kind of clarify it, as if there was, as if within early Messianic movement there was a party of people who wanted everybody circumcised, and a party that wanted nobody circumcised, and a party that wanted some people circumcised and other people not circumcised. We kind of want to split it up in so many ways and fracture it. There were different people with different opinions, but they weren't organized parties. These were just different people who had different opinions. And that was a reflection of Judaism, by the way. That wasn't a reflection that the Messianic movement was split along its own lines. And they were just as divided as everybody else was divided. And they just brought their divisions with them when they became believers in Messiah. They didn't just go away overnight. So the whole language about parties is really not part of it. But what we have is that they ate with non-Jews before, then they stopped doing so, And because people who came from Jerusalem, whoever these people were, we don't know if they were believers, we don't know if they were non-believers, we don't actually know so much about them. We just know that they came from James, from Yaakov, right? And we know that Yaakov was a respected man. A respected man by everyone. In the Messianic community, obviously, and in a non-Messianic community as well. We have plenty of historical sources that talk about Yaakov being respected in the Jewish community, period. Period. He was considered a righteous man, even by people who didn't agree with him ideologically. So, one can say that what has happened is they denied their conviction and were deceptive about what their true beliefs were about eating the Gentiles. See, don't think that they've changed their mind all of a sudden and now they're reverting to something. These people believed that it was okay. And they stopped doing it because of these visitors. So they have denied their true beliefs, in a sense. That's what we're talking about. It's not that they stopped believing what they believe. They simply denied their beliefs. Now let me say just a few words about eating with Gentiles. This is a little bit of a set aside. The reason why I address this topic is because this is where a lot of misunderstanding falls. What does it mean eating with Gentiles? What does that sort of say constitute? First of all, I'm going to say that the issue is not here. What is not here is not the issue of kosher or non-kosher food. We're not talking about eating with Gentiles equals eating biblically forbidden foods. Because if you read this incident and this is what you walk away with, you're reading something between the lines. Because it's not there. You're not going to see this. Many people, very often, as they read this passage, what they assume is they assume the Jews, who lived there in Antioch have abandoned their eating habits and disregarded all the biblical commandments of eating, kosher food and ate all kinds of treif with the goyim. That's the idea. That's what they say. Okay, so we live in a Gentile city. We might as well, roll with the flow here. That's what people assume. That was the normal way how they lived. It's a common assumption. But that is something we can imagine in our modern 21st century culture and our environment to be. Why? Because we actually see that happen all the time. But that was not so. There's nothing in these verses to suggest that the food that were eaten with the Gentiles was anything different than what Jews ate among themselves. We're actually not told a word about the contents of the food. So to assume that they were necessarily eating food that was unclean is purely an assumption on the part of a reader, on the part of an interpreter. So people assume that if you eat with a Gentile, one has to eat what would be primarily an unclean food. If you eat with a Gentile, don't you know that that's what Gentiles eat? The Gentiles eat pepperoni pizza, ham and cheese, mushu pork, shrimp on the Barbie. That's what Gentiles eat. That's like the menu, So they assume that this is you're going to share a meal with Gentiles, that's what you're going to share. Not so. How is it not so? Well, actually the categories of clean and unclean, if we're going to think about it, okay? We're going to go back to Torah. The categories of clean and unclean apply to what? Apply to meat and fish, right? That's pretty much it. Most Mediterranean people ate very little of that. Very little of that. That wasn't just an everyday fare for them. People did not eat meat that much. Most meals were vegetarian. And most Gentiles, if they ate something that would be considered unbiblical, unclean by biblical standards, knew very well that for Jews this would be a problem, and knew very well this would be one rare occasion that this would happen. So the occurrence of this issue and the occurrence of it on an everyday basis would be so small, so minute, that I don't think it would be even an issue. And so in our world where food is mass produced and meat products are being mass produced and things like that, and they're so easily affordable, so readily available for, cheaper than a loaf of bread, we're talking about it. Yeah, we assume they ate the way we did, but that's all the evidence that we have from the ancient time. Archaeological evidence, literary evidence does not suggest that people ate that way. They had very different diets. They ate very little meat and fish. So again, if you imagine a situation where a Gentile and a Jew are eating together, and a Gentile knows that what he's eating is probably not good, or acceptable to a Jew. So why would they want to have somebody violate their good conscience? Why would you put anything in front of a person that you knew that they could not eat in a good conscience? I mean, knowingly you wouldn't. And remember, most of these Gentiles were already being discipled. They already came, they already hung around the synagogue, they've been around the Jewish community, they know what makes Jews different from Gentiles. That's one of the first things that people learn about Jews. Is if you interact with Jewish people, you don't learn these things almost right away. So, anyway, people read into it, people read between the lines. So that's the first part that I have to say about eating with Gentiles. The second part is the issue about eating in these verses is not, the Gentiles brought something forbidden to the potluck, okay? But the very act of eating with Gentiles. What is the problem? The root, the issue, is the very act of eating with Gentiles. That's exactly what was not acceptable. It's not what they were eating, it's who they were eating with. Okay? That is the true issue, now that we're past the whole trade kosher idea. So, this was a cultural taboo for Jews, eating with Gentiles. A big, serious cultural taboo. To most modern Westerners, this seemed like a very trivial issue, because who cares who eats with what, and what do you eat, and eating with somebody, what does that mean? To a Westerner, it might not mean much, but in the East, it makes the world of difference. Because eating in the East is not merely a social activity, it's a spiritual, intimate activity that points to the nature of one's relationship with that person with whom you're eating. So in a social context, if you see people eating together, you can make certain assumptions about the nature of their relationship. And so eating was very often a religious practice, because a person, that was a very spiritual part of their life. If you remember Yeshua, he was criticized for eating with sinners, right? Meaning he was eating with who? With Jews who were not repentant of their sin and continued to live in sin. Everybody knows, people sin and things like that, but when he says eating with sinners, he'd be eating with people who are continuously living in a lifestyle that is definitely anti-Torah, that is definitely unrighteous, kind of in your face. I'm not repenting. And so Yeshua goes and eats with them. Well, what does that mean? Why does he do that? That's his way of bringing them closer. Eating had a very deep meaning for Easterners, and meals or eating together, they just expressed relationship and the depth of relationship. So Gentiles were, of course, considered unclean by the Jews, which that's the taboo. They were idol worshippers, evildoers, who should not be given such an honor. Why would you want to eat with those people? So along the same line of thinking, what Yeshua was basically criticized for eating with sinners, the same would be the reflection on Shaul or anybody else eating with a Gentile. Why would you want to eat with these sinners? You are trying to forge intimacy with people who have nothing in common. What do you have in common with them that you're trying to express this unity? Show your relationship with them. So everything that Gentiles did, for as far as Jews were concerned, rejected the Jewish values, and the two just should not mix. That's the way people looked at it. Of course, when we're speaking about Gentiles who became believers in the God of Israel, we're talking about something different now, right? Mm-hmm. And so they became believers in God of Israel, they became believers in Messiah, and they're far from being perfect, right? But they're on the right path. They're learning, they're growing, they're developing. And so, many Jews would have still had a hard time eating with them. Why? Because of the cultural taboos, because they haven't converted yet. And so there was a lot of prejudice in that matter. I just want you to realize there was a lot of cultural, historical, very real prejudice in that area. Just like prejudice exists in our society, and certain people wouldn't hang around with certain people. They would choose not to hang around. They'll go great length not to be in the same vicinity, in the same situation where closeness would be implied. There would be the same situation there. So most Jews were very ethnocentric. I told you earlier on how they expressed that. They were exclusive only to each other. And that was the problem. So the reasons behind such behavior, you and I can easily understand. It doesn't make that these things were right, but you and I can understand why people reacted that way. You and I can kind of have an idea and sort of say compare to our society maybe in some way and say, okay, I understand why people would behave this way. It doesn't make it right, but I understand why they're behaving that way, because there are certain precedents that they had in their mind that they could not overcome. So, we understand why people felt that way, why eating with Gentiles would cause such a problem, such an issue. Now remember that non-Jews turning to Israel's God in such great numbers also was a very new thing. This has never happened before. This is a new paradigm. No one saw this coming. No one really understood what was happening. And in reality, no one knew how to deal with this. Israel has never encountered these problems. And so something had to be developed, but right now we're kind of in this growing stage development. We don't know how we should treat this. So that's why you have this vacillation on Peter's part, right? He comes in, he eats with the Gentiles, it's not a problem. Then some people come that don't share his opinion, and he goes right back and pretends that, well, yeah, I'm just, I'm still following the old way, and that is his hypocrisy. That is exactly what he has done wrong. That's the evil. It's pretending as if nothing happened. What happened from Paul's perspective, from Shaul's understanding, is actually something huge happened. God has brought two together in a very miraculous and prophetic way. Yes. But to not eat with Gentiles would be to deny something that God has done. And so nobody kind of understands that. People are still wondering what's going on, and perhaps a few people like Shaul, people like him understand what's going on, and for them this is a big deal that they're pressing on, which is why he includes this particular instance of this argument with Kepha into this passage. So, sorry for the little short aside on eating with Gentiles. I think it was necessary because there's a lot of misunderstanding in that particular notion, in that particular text. Without being specifically said, people just let their minds run in different directions, and I think it just causes confusion. So I felt that it was important to kind of bring us into the text and bring us into the history and think out loud for a moment about how this really all transpired. So now we can come back to our verses and talk about the issue of eating, and it will surface again. I mean, it's in this text again, so perhaps we can fill in more details as we go, as we move along. So I want to read to you the next verses, let's see, 14 through 18. It's a big chunk, but it's kind of a unit that I really wanted to look at, and then we'll go through that. So let's see, 14 through 18, yeah, I believe so. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? We are Jews by nature, not sinners from among Gentiles. Nevertheless, knowing that the man is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus, even we have believed in Christ Jesus, so that we may be justified by faith in Christ, not by the works of the law. Since by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. But if while seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have also been found sinners, is Christ then a minister of sin? May it never be. For if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, I prove myself to be a transgressor. So I'm reading from NASB, by the way, if you're wondering. So English terminology really doesn't matter because we're going to get into the original anyway. Okay, so verses 14 through 18. Shaul explains in verse 14 why he called such behavior hypocrisy right here. It was not straightforward, he said, in regards to the good news message, in regards to the gospel, right? Gospel, good news. Now here's what I want you to remember. I want you to remember what the gospel, what the good news for Shaul means. He has a very particular interpretation. He has a very particular explanation of how he explains what the good news is. And we talked about this in our preliminary sessions on the earlier parts. I said that his particular definition of good news is eschatological fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. It's the Abrahamic covenant. It's becoming the blessing to all families of the earth, right? And that's being fulfilled for Shaul. And so the reason why Gentiles are coming in Now, and the reason why God opens the doors to Gentiles is in fulfillment of that prophecy. So to him, that's the good news. To him, Abrahamic covenant, in a sense, is being fulfilled. That's the good news. So that's how he sees it. And that's why he says he is not straightforward about the truth of good news. He's not being honest about how we understand the gospel. Okay, so I know this may be unusual understanding of the gospel for some people, but that is exactly how Shaul understood it. So Shaul called Kepha out and said some very harsh words. Unfortunately, these words are often misunderstood if a person stops merely at verse 14. So if you see this saying in the saying that he says, if you being a Jew live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is that you compel Gentiles to live like Jews? So if you stop right there, you will not understand everything else that he's saying. I mean, the solution to understanding that statement right there in verse 14, which is kind of cryptic, because we read it and it's not straightforward. We don't really see what is he getting to. Why is he saying that Kepha is living like a Gentile? You know, we are influenced again by what? By our modern life, by our modern understanding of language, but also we're influenced by the doctrines, the teachings that we have heard around. We can't just, you know, vacuum them out of our head. They actually spin around there, and they inform our understanding. So our perception is based on what we know. Okay? So when people look at this, you know, people have been influenced by Christian theology for a long time. They're saying, all right, so Shaul is calling Peter out, and he's calling him a Gentile. So he lives in an improper way. He's not faithful to the Torah. So the only way we can deal with this is really to read everything up to 18 and understand it, and then we'll come back, and I promise I'll come back to this particular cryptic statement in verse 14, and it will become much simpler after we read the rest. So, number of complicated things that I have to explain that will make sense. Verse 15, look at that. He says, we're Jews by nature, and not sinners from the Gentiles. Such a strange and almost insensitively sounding phrase, right? I mean, just think. He says, we're Jews by nature. This is conversation between Shaul and Kepha, right? And he's doing it publicly, too. But there's other Jews there. So he says, we're Jews by nature. We're not sinners of Gentiles. So if Gentiles would be sitting there, they would be offended by that, right? You can imagine that. Kind of insensitive. But it is insensitive. But this is a very typical thinking of a Jew, first century, very ethnocentric. He's very concentrated on himself and what it means to be a Jew. And he can be a little rough. So, Gentiles are sinners. That's a fact. That's what Jewish people think. That's what everybody thinks. That's the perspective. What does it mean to be a sinner? Remember, no Christianity, no Ten Commandments, no morality, just paganism. So when we're talking about Gentiles, we're not talking about 21st century Gentile, an average non-Jew walking down the street. We're not talking about an average European man or anything like that. Here's what I want you to think. I want you to have a composite view of a Gentile that perhaps will fit a little bit more the paradigm of what they're thinking a Gentile is. I'm going to name all kinds of peoples, and I want you to figure out and think of the kind of practices these people do and the kind of lifestyles they live. Okay, how about this? Asians, Hindus, Africans, Arabs. How about the Taliban? We put them in there. Aborigines, Amazon Indians, Eskimo, and etc., etc., etc. You can fill in the gap. Put in all the kinds of unique, unusual people that you've ever seen in your life, or experienced their lifestyle, or have seen their customs, traditions that are completely non-Jewish, completely non-Western. And so Western civilization, of course, being influenced by Christianity so much, has become really, you know, a reflection of Judaism in many ways. That's why we call it Judeo-Christian, right? But so imagine when you hear the word Gentile, you got to think how they were thinking, and that's what they were thinking. They were thinking of the practices that would be similar to, you know, Hindu practices or the Amazon Indian practices, you know, with all the, you know, color that comes with that. So imagine that composite view of a Gentile, and that's what they're talking about. So that when he says, you know, Gentiles are sinners, that's what he means. Look how these people live. They live in a lifestyle of sin. They're born in a state of sin, right? Far away from God, don't know anything. And here's something that, if I already said this, you know, I apologize for reiterating, but it's really important. Don't think of sin as a deed. Think of it as a state of being. Think of it as a condition. Think of it a condition of one's being and a condition of one's existence. It is very, very easy, again, for us to be misled by a modern definition, our society's definition of sin. When people think sin, they think a deed, a bad deed that I've done. Well, a lot of times the scripture, when it talks about sin, it doesn't talk about a particular bad deed that you have done. It talks about a way of life. It talks about a condition. So when we're saying we are sinners or we are in sin, we're saying we're living in a perpetual condition of sin state. We are unrepentant, we're distant from God, we're far away. So that's what, when you call somebody a sinner, you know, that's what you're talking about. When it says that Yeshua ate with sinners, this is what we're talking about. He didn't just eat with people who occasionally had, you know, a little lapse of judgment and did something wrong. He ate with people who lived that way, purposefully, intentionally, for a long time. They lived in a state of sin. So think of it this way. When Shaul says the Gentiles are sinners, that's what he's talking about. That the nations of the world are far away from God. They live in a constant state of sin. That's how they were born. That's how they are. Now think of Jews. Remember, he contrasts them. Think about Jews. Not that Jews never sin, but they do grow up in an environment of God's truth, right? In a society that's built on God's laws, built on God's principles. Everything from birth teaches them to live with God and for God, and in the way God prescribed. Everything, the entire world. Now, sin, of course, is not supposed to be a Jewish lifestyle. Again, don't think of 21st century Jews. You got to take out the modern ideas out of your mind. There were no non-practicing secular or atheistic Jews in ancient days. So either you were a Jew or you were one of the nations. You've walked across the line and you've walked away basically from your heritage. That's it. So either you are this way or that way. It wasn't like that. If a person called themselves a Jew, they lived as a Jew. And there's no point of them calling themselves a Jew and not living like one. So that's just the ancient world. That's how it was. And so when Shaul says that we're Jews by nature, he means we're born that way. We're raised that way. We're not proselytes who lived as pagans and then now have become convinced to forsake our wicked ways and have gone to the side of God of Israel, and now we've embraced this truth and all the commandments, and now we're trying to live a good, righteous life before God. You know, that's the way he's saying. He's saying, look, we grew up this way. For us, we came through this. We know how to live. What he's saying is, he's saying to Peter, you and I are natural Jews, and you should know better. You can't behave like this. This is inexcusable to us. You can't deny the truth and just walk away from it. You're Jewish. Your conscience should eat you up right now. Because you grew up this way. You're natural Jewish. You grew up with this morality. You can't just step back from your morality and take a break. That's what he's saying. This behavior is really inexcusable. So look at verse 16. And the argument continues in verse 16. He says, we know that a person does not, become justified by the works of the law. Remember, justify means what? Means to be righteous. To be justified means to be made just or made righteous. Righteous, of course, means to be forgiven. Righteous does not mean to be perfect. Righteous does not mean to be sinless. Righteous does not mean to be holy. One is made right by the virtue of God's mercy. One is acquitted. One is forgiven. When you become justified, it's like going to the court for a traffic ticket and the cop did not show up and the judge just says, okay, you were justified, case dismissed. That doesn't mean that you didn't speed. It just means you didn't get punished. It just means you were in a good situation and the circumstances worked out so that mercy came your way versus punishment. So, that's what he means by righteous. Hopefully getting that across. Of course, in Greek, righteous, dikaios, is the equivalent of Hebrew tzaddik, right? And that's what these words really mean. They both mean the same thing. A person who is right, or a person who is fair. You see, tzedakah in Hebrew means fairness, means equity. That's really what it means, not just righteousness in the sense of like holiness. We're not talking about holiness, we're not talking about sinlessness. We're talking about a person who lives a fair life, an equitable life. A person who is right, who's in a right state with God, in a sense. A person who tries to make the crooked things straight, in a sense. That's what we're talking about when we're saying a righteous person. So God is the one who justifies, right? God is the one who makes righteous, correct? And so a person is not able to do this for himself. He actually needs God's help to make him righteous. And this is not accomplished by the works of the law. That's what Shaul says. You cannot accomplish righteousness by the works of the law. And now we get to this term, works of the law. This is a big theological term that is so loaded, you can read books and books and books and books on what it means, works of the law. I'm going to try to break it down for you in the two simple ways, two simple things, two statements that I want to tell you about the works of the law. Number one, before I tell you what the meaning of this phrase, work of the law, is, let me say it this way. The term is unique. The term is unique to Shaul. It is found in theological writings that belong to him. You're not going to find it other places. And so the difficulty is to make common sense of this explanation, we have to have a point of reference. We're not sure what Shaul means when he says the works of the law, because he's the only one who uses the phrase. And so then the question is, how is he using the phrase? And that's really all we can analyze and try to come up with what it means. Now the common sense explanation that you will hear pretty much everywhere, if you ask people, what is the works of the law? They'll say, well, these are the commandments of Torah. Works of the law, right? It's what you do when you work out the Torah. When you do the commandments, that's the works of the law. That's what you will hear everywhere else. And so, like I said, since there are no outside references, it's kind of difficult to argue. It's difficult to know exactly what Shaul means. But here's the trick. Every time he uses it, he uses them in a negative sense. When he says the works of the law, he never has anything to do to say good about the works of the law. The works of the law is always something negative. So how do I know that it doesn't mean Torah's commandments? Because to say that Shaul says something negative about Torah and then turns around and says something positive about Torah would make him certifiably insane. So that means either I misunderstood his very clear statements that Torah is good and spiritual and things like that, or I misunderstood his cryptic statement about the works of the law. Which one is easier misunderstood? Obviously, this cryptic statement about whatever he means by works of the law is probably the one I misunderstood, but his plain words, I'm pretty sure on that. So, therefore, the works of the law cannot be the same as the commandments of Torah, because Shaul uses them in a negative way. It could be something very closely related, and we'll explore this in a second, but what it is, we have to figure out. So he probably made up this term himself, and that's why we don't have any other references. And so we have to look through the context and figure it out. And if anyone of you wants to study that through, I encourage you, go ahead and do that. Look through Shaul's writings and find those phrases. So here's what I think the works of the law mean. I'm going to give you two possible meanings. Since we ruled out the possibility of meaning the Torah, the commandments of Torah. It can mean, number one, that it is a mark or sign commandments. The works of the law is a terminology that represents mark or sign commandments. What I mean by mark and sign commandments is that there are certain mitzvot, there are certain commandments that have particular external visual expressions, manifestations, right? Torah is teaching. Torah means a body of principles, and then it has its works. Works will be the visual expressions of the internal message. The Torah is teaching, just kind of like nebulous, general, right? But then its works would be something visual, something you can actually see. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about something like Brit Milah, for example. Brit Milah, the circumcision. Circumcision is a visual sign. Is it a commandment? Yes. So this would be a visual sign, a visual manifestation of a person fulfilling a particular commandment of the Torah. How about tzitzit on the corners of the garments? That would be another visual manifestation of the commandment that God gives. God gives the commandment, but the only way you can actually see that person's following if he has, shown to you a visual sign of him doing it. Another one, tefillin. Tefillin. When people put on tefillin, there will be the artifact that has to do with prayer. The Jewish people that will be another visual manifestation. How about kashrut? If a person eats only clean food in the world where people eat pretty much anything they want, that would also be a very easily identifiable visual manifestation of God's law, of a person actually living it out. Sabbath would be another one. If a person behaves differently on Sabbath from the rest of the world, if they actually follow what God said on the Sabbath, that would really set them apart visually. You can observe, what I'm trying to say is, you can watch a person, you can observe a person, and you could see that they act this certain way and figure out that they're following Torah. So that would be the works of the law, because these are the signs of person's righteousness. These are the signs of his fidelity, his commitment to Torah. These are external signs of his internal commitment, right? And his actual lifestyle. Because many other commandments of the Torah, you would have no idea that a person is following them or not following them by simply observing them. You have no idea. But these ones are very easy. If you watch for those signs, those are the signs that you would notice. And that's how you would figure a person out. So observable signs, observable marks of the commandments. So that's one possible meaning of what the works of the law can mean. And the second possible meaning is that the works of the law in Shaul's language basically means an improper fulfillment of the commandments. Works of the law. Listen to this. In other words, what I'm saying is mere works, works only, or mere ritualistic, obligatory obedience without a genuine, full-hearted belief. If you obey Torah and it's not within your heart and intent to please God and to worship Him, if you do it out of improper motivation, it's possible to obey Torah with wrong attitude. You know that. It's very possible to do so. Not out of love for God, but because of the fear of judgment of the community or pressure of the family or whatever it may be. Motivation and intention is very important in Jewish thinking. And so because Torah obedience is meant to be an act of worship, then not just something that you learn behavior. Oh, we just do this because we do this. That's just who we are. That's what we do. Well, see, that's when a person who doesn't understand why he does what he does. How can that be an act of worship? Because there's no intention behind it. There's no purpose behind it. So what we're talking about is we're talking about works of the law, meaning deeds that a person does without the true faith and trust and reliance of God or an intent of worshiping Him, but simply a behavior that is patterned after the law, but not without the intent, the internal intent of worshiping God with doing that. So that would be mere works of the law, right? Only works, because the Torah is so much more than works. It's not just about your deeds. It's not just about your actions. It's also about your intentions. If your intentions are not right, then it would be merely works, merely actions that by themselves will not stand, before God in judgment. So either one of these definitions can be used successfully to understand what Shaul actually is trying to say in these verses. I tend to embrace the second option that I expressed to you, just for your reference. But you can use either one of these definitions that I gave you, and either one of them would actually make sense. These are two most popular outside of the box, sort of say, interpretations of what Shaul means by the works of the law. Because the one that's inside the box, right, the one that's been taught for centuries now, is that just merely means following Torah. The works of the law just means keeping Torah. So, if it's not that, if it's something negative, then what is it? Well, it's either trusting in the visual outward workings, like circumcision or Sabbath or kashrut, trusting that would make you righteous because you are displaying your righteousness visibly, so that obviously makes you righteous. Or it's trusting in something that is merely works, that's not, the heart is not in it. You're doing the right thing, but your intent is very far away from God's purposes. So, these are possibilities. Either one of them, like I said, will work to explain what Shaul is saying here. So, we're still in verse 16. We're stuck there. And I have to explain another Greek phrase here for you. I'm sorry, it just keeps coming and coming. This verse is full of presents. The Greek phrase is faith in Christ here. You see, in Greek it doesn't say that exactly. I don't know, whatever your translation says, there's going to be different ones. But it doesn't say that exactly. What it is this is a genitive construct. I don't know how familiar you guys are with grammar, but genitive in the Greek grammar basically signifies possession. Okay? So it's like putting a preposition of between the words, or putting the apostrophe s. Something belongs to something. So when I want to say that something belongs to somebody else, or something is of something else, I'm expressing it using a genitive grammar. I'm basically putting my construction becomes in a genitive case. And so, Greek has conjugation and has cases. So to be exactly precise, what the Greek text actually says, it says that not faith in Christ, but faith of Christ, or Christ's faith. Okay? Think of it this way. But if you were to translate the sentence this way, it would make no sense. If you were to replace the phrase that I just pointed out to you with the phrase that I suggested, it will still make no sense. And you're going to say, well, that's way more confusing than what I have right here. But here's where I have to explain one more fact. The Greek word pistis means faith. It doesn't just mean faith, it also means faithfulness. Okay? Faithfulness. Just like in Hebrew, the idea of emet and emunah, are connected. Amen, when people say amen, what are they saying? It's true, it's accurate, it's faithful, it's right. So these are cognate concepts. And so in Greek, actually the word pistis means both faith and faithfulness. So if you translated this phrase by, instead of putting faith in Christ, but something like faithfulness of Messiah, right here, then the whole sentence will make sense. So if you replace faith in Christ with faithfulness of Messiah, then it will make total sense. However, as it makes sense, it will also alter its meaning. We'll talk about it. If we replace this phrase, faith in Christ, with faithfulness of Messiah, this is what we're going to get. I'm going to read it partially, verse 16. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, i.e., the external signs, or the works without faith. That's what we mean by the works of the law. But through faithfulness of Messiah Yeshua, even we, meaning Jews by nature, have believed in Messiah Yeshua so that we may be justified, meaning acquitted or pardoned, made righteous, by faithfulness of Messiah and not the works of the law. This makes perfect sense now. But here's the difference. Even though it makes sense, it changes the meaning quite a lot. It implies that it's not some abstract believing that makes persons righteous or forgiven. It's not up to our ability to believe that actually brings us into that standing with God. It's not that, okay, I don't believe and now I'm not righteous. It's not my ability. It's His faithfulness. It's the fact of what Yeshua did. It's the fact of His obedience. It's the fact of Him going and dying and going through with this. So it's not on me now, it's fully on Him. And I truly am accepting it as a gift, and it's not something completely dependent on me. So the works of the law, whichever meaning you wish to pick, cannot do that. See, they cannot make me righteous. But because of Yeshua's obedience, His obedience was perfect. Even if I try to keep the Torah, I'm still going to have problems. I'm still going to have issues. There's times I'm going to do it wrong, with wrong intention, or however. I may not have the worshipful attitude, and I'll get mechanical about it. Think about it this way. But Yeshua's obedience was perfect. See? The works of the law only create an appearance, an external illusion, okay, of being right. And as far as anyone is concerned, by looking on the outside, because we can't look inside people, it looks like a person is a good person. Oh, look, they got everything going for them. But on the inside, that may not be true. So how do you ensure that's actually true on the inside? Well, only Yeshua's faithfulness, because He was perfect. He was perfect. He obeyed or perfect. So now it's not because we believe in something, but because He has done it, and we trust in Him. And we rely upon Him to fill that which we lack. So, something to think about. It really flips this whole sentence upside down totally. So, and then of course the last phrase in verse 16, it says the works of the law, again clearly a negative term, are not able to justify anyone. That's really what it says. They can't do that. No one understands what Shaul attaches to this term. to make total sense. Torah does not make one righteous. So that's what he says. That is what it was given for, my friends. He says Torah doesn't make one righteous. I mean, if that's what he says, but that's what it was given for, to help people live a proper life, right? Mm-hmm. So in a sense, it was given to make one righteous. But it says it will not. It says external and superficial fulfillment of commandments will not make one righteous. It has to be the true fulfillment of commandments. And you see, and that's something that's impossible for you and I. We can't do it. We can't do it perfectly. We can't measure up. We simply can't. We can try, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. But the fact is that we're going to mess up. And so Yeshua is the only one who did it. And so, the longest, the most beautifully tied tzitzit, the most expensive talit, the most meticulous Shabbat observant, and complete kosher meat from the best market you can ever find will not make one righteous, apart from the true relationship with God. See that? All these good things, merely applied externally, are pointless. This is what Yeshua is, this is what Shaul is talking about when he says the works of the law. That's what he's trying to get across with this strange term. So I can do all the things to appear righteous, but on the outside, but really far away from God. So that's what I mean when I say mere works and things like that, and works of the law. All right, so verses 17 and 18. Look at that now. The verse is over. Finally, we've got a long explanation on this verse, but Shaul's thought is still not complete. Look at this. He's got to hang on a little bit more. He's not done. He says here, while we Jews by nature were seeking justification in Messiah, meaning that we chose to trust in what he has done. We are seeking justification in Messiah. Not justification in the Torah. We're seeking justification in Messiah. So we're choosing to trust what he's done. We have discovered something about ourselves. We're sinners. It's a big discovery.
Yes.
While we are seeking justification in Messiah, we realize that our Torah following is really not all that we thought it was. We felt good about it because it seemed all good. But then, deep inside, we'll all of a sudden discover this: we're sinners. And that's not a good idea. That's not a good thing. Not a good thought. And so, I believe that the use of sinners right here is a little bit more metaphoric, a little bit more symbolic. Because, remember, in verse 14, he just said, we're not sinners. Remember, Gentile sinners, we Jews, we know better. Right? So he just said that. So is he again contradicting himself?
Yes.
A little bit. So what you have to come to as a good interpreter is to a conclusion that either he didn't mean the first part or he didn't mean the second part. So I tend to think that this particular statement, when he says that, you notice it's very emphatic. It's a little bit poetic, right? He probably uses this a little, not in a direct 100% straightforward way. He just said, we're not sinners. So if being made righteous by Yeshua, by his faithfulness, is outside of ourselves, and our obedience to Torah, then we should treat Gentiles who are made righteous by the same way equally. That's what Shaul is trying to get to, slowly and gradually, with his long tirade, really. If we are made righteous outside of Torah, then how can we treat Gentiles who are not following Torah just the right way? Badly. That's what he's trying to say. And that is exactly the hypocrisy that is being implied here. He's saying you're asking these Gentiles to act more like Jews. You won't eat with them unless they're this way. You see? That's the problem. So we shouldn't require of them that which did not make us righteous. That's what he's saying. If you hear his point right there, it's a little bit difficult because it's kind of muddled there, but that's what he's talking about. We've been found sinners. That's the disingenuous part about us. In the middle of all this, we realize that all of this that we have is really not all that we thought. And that's what he's asking. Is Yeshua an agent or a servant? Literally in Greek it says servant of sin. Is he an agent of sin if he brings out this behavior in us? Meaning, after believing Yeshua, we can still behave like that. Does that mean that Yeshua is bad for us? We realize that we're sinners and we just keep keep rolling on? No, of course not. Shaul does this. He asks a question that makes no sense, and he answers it in a completely opposite way. He does this for the effect. But then he says, but if I rebuild that which I destroyed, he says in verse 18, so what is that all about? But if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, I prove myself to be a transgressor. Wow. What he's basically trying to say here, if I presume that that this religious and cultural barrier that stood between Jews and non-Jews, if I just restore it, then I'm becoming a transgressor. I'm falling into sin. God has done something. Remember? The gospel, the Abrahamic covenant. God has done something in eschatology. God has done something in these end times in which we're living in. It's a new beginning, and I'm undoing it. That's what he's trying to say. I become a transgressor. I become a sinner. That's what it means. To transgress means to fall into sin. So, again, keep in mind that Shul's thinking about Abrahamic covenant, and that kind of helps a little bit. What he's talking about, of course, Abrahamic covenant, the blessing of the Gentiles, the family becoming greater, and so, Peter, you're acting in the way opposite of this. You're acting that this didn't happen. Now you see, this is what the crux of being disingenuous is all about. This is what being dishonest, this is what not being right from Shaul's perspective, is living as though the promise to Abraham that was made is not being fulfilled in his generation. That is the accusation against Peter. It's a pretty heavy one. It's kind of difficult to catch. We have to really dig through all these verses to make sense. So now is the time to go back to that cryptic part in verse 14 that we read, and that should make sense a little bit now. Okay? And so if we read it in the light of the greater context we discussed, Shaul basically says, why do you, a Jew, act like a Gentile and not like a Jew? Well, what does he mean by acting like a Gentile? Jews follow the truth and do not live deceitfully, as Gentiles do. Remember, we talked about that's what Gentiles do. They're sinners. They grew up in this atmosphere of sin, so they do this. Jews, you should know better. You can't live like this. And then the second part says, look at that. The second part says, why do you force non-Jews to live like Jews when you know that there's no necessity in that, in a sense? Why do you force these? If you act this way, why do you ask them to act like you? Because then in the end they're going to emulate you anyway, because you're the one who's teaching them how to live the right way anyway. You're the example. So he's saying you being a contradiction to yourself. It's not that Kepha is not being Jewish enough. It's not that he's slipped into, eating shrimp and a Barbie with the Gentiles, and all of a sudden when the Jewish boys come to town and says, oh no, I'm not going to do that anymore. That's not what's happening in these verses. What's happening in these verses is a little bit more eschatological. It's a little bit bigger. It's a little bit tied to the Abrahamic covenant. It's the disingenuous part of how the Gentiles are being treated, even though they're redeemed the same way as Jews are, outside of Torah, outside of their own personal trying. It's all through Yeshua. Now that's a powerful message now, and that becomes a little bit convicting. And so that's what this statement about not living like a Jew is. Now we can kind of understand it. So how is this being forced? People always ask me. When you look at this, why are you forcing Gentiles to live this way? He says. Well, remember, Jews are older brothers to the Gentile believers. They're examples, they're guides of this new world of spirituality. Remember, Gentiles come in, they've never read the Bible, and they've never heard these things. This is all new for them. This is something they're going to grow into. And here you are looking up to somebody who is supposed to be an example, supposed to be an older brother, and they start behaving this way. They don't fully understand what's happening to them yet. They're like little children, just being led, right? And they're trusting, because they know what's happened in front of them. They know what's happened inside of them, and the people that surround them are good spiritual people, but they don't fully understand what that all means. That realization comes much, much later. And for some people, it never really comes, but that's not the point. That's not the point. Look at this. He says, suddenly, people are refusing to eat with them unless they're circumcised. So now I'm going to eat only with the circumcised. I'm going to eat only with the Jews. What message does that send to the Gentiles who have just been redeemed, who've been called brothers, and I ate with them before, but now I stopped eating with them? What happens? Well, they're saying, I'm not good enough. I need something else. I need more. I need to get circumcised. Then he'll eat with me. That's what I need. I need to convert all the way. So the person gets an inferiority complex. And he runs. And now he's not sure of his identity anymore. Now he thinks that whatever this faith that he has is not enough. Now he has to do something more. And that's the disingenuous part. That's the problem. And that is why Shaul gets so upset, and that's why he criticizes Kepha. He's not truly being the Jew worthy of his calling in the full and best sense of this word. He's being more Gentile-like, denying the obvious truth. So hopefully verse 14 now makes a little bit more sense why he's calling him these words. No, Peter did not ignore Torah, and he did not live like the non-Jews. What he did is he ignored God's truth out of expedience and behaved as someone who does not know the truth and lived the way he felt was best for the moment. So in justification of Peter's actions, this was a very turbulent times in Jerusalem, and Jews and Romans were a constant verge of war. There was a lot of struggle between Gentiles and Jews at that time. What you and I also miss is the turbulent nature of relationship between Jews and Gentiles. Jews are an occupied nation. They're subdued, subjugated people, taxed. They have good reasons not to like Gentiles. Apart from all the wickedness and idol worship and all that stuff, they're being oppressed by these people. So, can you imagine the complexity of this relationship now? So, when you have a community that starts to show love, starts to show some kind of harmony, imagine how precious that is. And so, to justify, Peter, tensions in Jerusalem are very sharp. And these people come from Jerusalem, and we have a good thing going over here, but they're coming with really bad attitude because of what just happened. Well, maybe I shouldn't get them all upset. Maybe I should just try to smooth things over. Let me see if I can figure out how to make this better. If I try to show them how friendly we're with Gentiles here, well, that might just turn out worse for everybody. So let's not do it. So there's a scenario like that. Just think history, and it will help you to see how this text comes out. So this was a long path to get where we got, okay? And I had to go through some serious explanations, but now you understand all my intentions, and now you hopefully start to see Shaul's reasoning, the big picture of what he's trying to say. All right, so now the finish line. 19, 20, and 21. We're almost done, guys. 19, 20, and 21. All right. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. Now, what I want you to see right away is I want you to see a repetition of the words that are actually in the very beginning of the first chapter of this very writing that he starts. He talks about the favor of God, right, the grace. He talks about nullifying it, and he talks about how he sees Yeshua, and he talks about who loved and gave himself up for me. Remember, it's in his introduction, the very letter. But here's what I want you to see: this strange statement that is very hard to explain. Very strange words. Through the Torah, I died to the Torah. Chew on that. Explain that. Through the Torah, I died to the Torah. Now leave it up to Shaul to say something so incredibly cryptic that we're going to be sitting here and scratching our heads trying to figure out what in the world is he trying to say. He's doing this intentionally. He's speaking in a very poetic way. Very poetic way. Again, not an easy phraseology. But we're in a roll, so I think we can handle this. There's several possible explanations. Again, it's very hard to get into the mind of a writer in that time. Very hard. Several possible explanations. But for the sake of time, I'm going to offer the one that makes most sense. Okay? I'm going to go through all of them. Maybe another time we can. So the Torah foresees what is happening to the Gentiles. Right? The Abrahamic covenant. Abrahamic covenant is Torah. Think of it this way. Through this promise, Shaul says that he chooses to die to Torah, to the commandments that limit the interaction of Jews and Gentiles. Remember, there's limits in the Torah of interaction with Jews and Gentiles. The only terms upon which Jews and Gentiles are supposed to interact is when Gentiles become Jews. It's there in the Torah. Other than that, we're going to be separate. Guess what? Gentiles, not going to eat Pesach. Can't have sacrifice. Can't do this. They got to be circumcised. They want to eat that? They got to be circumcised. The Torah says you can find terefah, the meat that was torn up by animals, which would, terefah means treif, which means unkosher, right? Unclean meat. Well, it says, well, a Jew can't eat it, but you can sell it to a Gentile. To a ger, it says, to a ger. Who's a ger? Ger is a sojourner. That's what the Torah says. You can sell it to the sojourner. Why? Because he's not circumcised, he's not a Jew. He's not obligated to the same standard that you are obligated to. You can't eat it, but you can sell it to them. You know. So there's a line of separation, very clear line of separation that you read in the books of Moses, very clearly. And people try to blur that line all the time, and I understand why. Because we're living in a different world, and when I say Gentile, we don't really mean that same or what people meant back in the days, right? So it's very easy for us to get lost in these categories. But we got to think with an ancient mind. So think of it this way. Abrahamic covenant, through the law, I dive to the law. Which law? The one that limited me from the interaction that actually was promised ahead of time. And here's you got to think of, again, Middle Eastern thinking. That revelation that is, there is primary revelation, there's secondary revelation. There is a, sort of say, priority table, if you want to think about it. Something that people don't realize about Torah is that there are some commandments that are more important, there are some commandments that are less important. There are some commandments that are weightier, and some are less weight. Most external commandments, like wearing the tzitzit or anything like that, they actually have less weight than respecting your parents, for example. See, that's big weight. You know, doing something ritual is very little weight. Doing something morally difficult and hard is actually much bigger weight. So Yeshua talks about priorities of Torah. And another thing is, you're not allowed to cancel out Torah with Torah. You can't fulfill one commandment so that it would actually make you violate the other commandment. Okay? And guess what? The heaviest commandment always takes the precedence. Always. So you can't fulfill a lesser commandment to violate a greater commandment. But you can do it the other way. The weightier commandment takes precedence. Always. A good example in Jewish theology, saving life. You can pretty much violate any but two commandments. All but two. To save a life. There's only two commandments you're not allowed to violate. That's it. You know, and so there are scenarios and situations where Torah comes against Torah, and you have to choose which one you're going to keep. So he says over here, through the Torah, I died to the Torah. Well, which one? If you think that for him, Abrahamic covenant is more important, why? Because it's earlier revelation. It's greater. It's more ancient. It's more big picture. Important. And then later comes Sinai. See, Abrahamic covenant concerns the whole world. Sinai concerns only Israel. So which one is kind of a bigger importance now all of a sudden? You know, weigh them in the scale. That's the idea. Think for a moment of what he's saying now. To the Torah. I died to the Torah. Which Torah is he dying to? And also understand that this is not a literal way that he's talking about it. He's talking about poetically, in a very kind of symbolic way. Because right there, the next verse, he talks about being crucified with Messiah, right? We know that didn't actually physically happen, but he said, I live my life as if I died there. As if I was right there dying with Yeshua. That's how I live my life. I've given it up. I have put myself to death willingly. I'm following my Messiah as if I right there died with him. And now I rose with him. Because if I died with him, I rose with him. And if I rose with him, I'm living a new life. And I'm a new person. I'm a new being. That's what he's talking about. So think about how that reflects. So in his thinking, that's pretty radical. It's pretty radical. But again, this is not exactly literal words. This is a little bit of a symbolic meaning. And then he says right here, he does not nullify or make ineffective God's grace. And remember what I told you grace means. A lot of times people misinterpret it as grace as being licensed to do pretty much anything they want. No, what it's really talking about is God's favor. I do not nullify God's favor. If you remember our previous conversations, we talked quite a bit about favor and what in the world is favor. God looked favorably upon Abraham. And he says, hey, I'm going to call you out. God had favor upon certain people in history. Something they didn't earn, something they didn't deserve, yet God looked upon them. He says, I loved you. And that's it. So that's my favor. And so then God has favor towards us in the same way. Did we earn it? Did we earn it that he paid attention to us? Did we earn something that he came to us out of all people? No, of course we didn't earn it. So we realize it's a favor, it's a gift, it's a present, it's something given to us. All we have to do is really accept it. So he says, I don't nullify the favor of God. And so if true righteousness, meaning the right standing with God, can be achieved by simply following the Torah, meaning through self-effort, right? If you just keep the commandments, just do it, like the commercial says. Just do it. Just keep the commandments. Then you'll have righteousness. No, you can't do it through self-effort. He's saying, if we can do it through self-effort, why do we need Yeshua? He says, the favor of God is Yeshua and his faithfulness to Torah. And I don't nullify this. Because if righteousness comes through simply doing what Torah says, then Yeshua didn't have to die. He didn't need to come at all. We don't have a problem. We don't need a solution. Yet we have the solution. And so the evidence is to the contrary. So as we kind of, muse and think about these things, that's what chapter ends with. And so you probably noticed how this is a little bit more heavier chapter than the previous ones. Because if you were here from the beginning, it's kind of dragged on a little bit. We talked about some big issues, big ideas, but now it's going to get really heated. Because guess what? With chapter 3, we're going into direct interaction with Galatians. No more history, no more retelling stories, no more anecdotes or anything like that. Now we're going to go into pure theological rhetoric with Galatians. And so the next session is verses 1 through 14 in chapter 3. That's what we're going to cover. It's going to talk about faith. It's going to talk about works of the law again. It's going to talk about curse and several different things. So I'll have a chance to introduce a few more new ideas to you. Maybe they're new, maybe not new, but hopefully this lesson has been instrumental in opening some new horizons for you.